The Japanese soldier never heard the bullet that killed him, but he did hear the soup can. That hollow, metallic clatter echoing through the jungle darkness, that was the last sound Private Kenji Yamamoto ever processed before a .30-06 round traveling at 2,800 feet per second entered his skull just above his left ear. He died wondering what that strange noise was. He would never know that a 10-cent Campbell's soup can, emptied of its tomato contents 6,000 miles away in a Chicago factory, had just signed his death warrant. 300 yards away, Sergeant Thomas Tin Man Hartley exhaled slowly, his right eye still pressed against the scope of his M1903A4 Springfield rifle. Through the magnified lens, he watched the enemy soldier crumple like a puppet whose strings had been cut. That made number 47, 65 more to go. What happened over those 5 days in April 1945, on a blood-soaked ridge in Okinawa that would later be called Hacksaw Ridge's Forgotten Brother, would become one of the most classified sniper operations of World War II. Not because of what Hartley did with his rifle, but because of what he did with something far simpler, something that cost less than a dime, something that every American soldier carried in his pack but never thought to weaponize. This is the true story of how one man, armed with a bolt-action rifle and 37 empty soup cans, killed 112 enemy soldiers in 120 hours and changed the way the United States military would think about psychological warfare forever. Thomas Earl Hartley was born on a Tuesday in 1922, in a farmhouse so remote that the nearest neighbor was a 40-minute walk through Kansas wheat fields. His father, Earl Sr., was a hard man, not cruel, but shaped by the Depression into something that had forgotten how to be soft. His mother, Margaret, had died giving birth to Thomas's younger sister, who followed her mother into the grave 3 days later. Thomas was 6 years old when he learned that death could visit without warning, take what it wanted, and leave you standing in a wheat field wondering why the world kept spinning. By the age of 8, Thomas could shoot a rabbit at 200 yards with his father's old Winchester. By 12, he could drop a coyote at 400. But it wasn't his shooting that made him special. It was his patience. While other boys his age fidgeted and complained, Thomas could lie motionless in the tall grass for hours, watching, waiting, becoming part of the landscape itself. His father called it the gift. The Army would later call it exceptional sniper temperament. Thomas just called it listening to the world. "The land talks," his father told him once, during one of their rare conversations. "Most people are too busy making noise to hear it. But if you shut up and pay attention, it'll tell you everything. Where the deer are, where the storm's coming from, where danger's hiding." Earl Sr. spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "You got your mama's ears, boy. You can hear what others can't." When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Thomas was 19 years old and had just finished his first semester at Kansas State University, studying agricultural science. He'd planned to take over the farm someday, to marry Lucy Whitmore from the next county, to live a quiet life among the wheat and the silence. The bombs that fell on Hawaii ended that dream before it could properly begin. He enlisted on December 8th. He was the first man in line at the Topeka recruitment office, having driven through the night to get there. The recruitment sergeant, a heavy-set man named O'Brien, with a face like a catcher's mitt, looked at the skinny farm boy and almost laughed. "Son, you weigh about $150 soaking wet. You sure you want to do this?" Thomas looked at him with those pale gray eyes that had watched his mother's coffin being lowered into frozen Kansas ground, eyes that had seen 100 animals die, eyes that had already learned to accept the unacceptable. "I'm sure," he said. During basic training at Fort Riley, Thomas distinguished himself in exactly one area: marksmanship. He qualified expert on his first attempt, scoring 247 out of a possible 250 on the standard rifle qualification.
The drill instructors had never seen anything like it. When asked how he'd learned to shoot so well, Thomas simply shrugged. "I paid attention," he said. It was Sergeant Major William Bill Tucker who first saw what Thomas Hartley could become. Tucker was a veteran of the First World War, one of the few American soldiers who had served alongside British snipers in the trenches of France. He understood that a sniper wasn't just a man who could shoot. He was a hunter, a psychologist, a ghost made of patience and precision. "Hartley," Tucker said one day, pulling the young private aside, "you ever think about becoming a sniper?" Thomas considered the question. In the movies, snipers were portrayed as cold-blooded killers, men without conscience or feeling. But Thomas knew that wasn't quite right. A sniper was just a farmer with a different kind of harvest. "Yes, Sergeant Major," he said. "I think about it quite a bit." 3 months later, Private Thomas Hartley was sent to the newly established Scout Sniper School at Camp Pendleton. There, under the blazing California sun, he would learn the art of invisible death. He would learn to calculate windage and elevation, to read terrain, to camouflage himself so perfectly that men could walk within 10 feet of him without knowing he was there. He would learn to slow his heartbeat, to control his breathing, to squeeze a trigger so gently that the rifle seemed to fire itself. But the most important lesson he would learn had nothing to do with shooting at all. It was a lesson about sound, about psychology, about the terrible vulnerability of the human mind when faced with something it cannot understand. It was a lesson that would begin with an empty soup can. The jungles of Guadalcanal smelled like rotting vegetation and death. Thomas Hartley, now a corporal, had been on the island for 6 weeks, and the smell had seeped into his skin, his clothes, his dreams. At night, the jungle came alive with sounds that no Kansas farm boy could have imagined: the screech of tropical birds, the rustle of unseen creatures, the constant drip of moisture from leaves the size of umbrellas. And underneath it all, always, the sounds of war. Distant gunfire, the thump of mortars, the screams of men dying in languages Thomas didn't understand. By August 1942, Thomas had already killed 23 confirmed enemy soldiers. 23 lives ended by the gentle pressure of his finger on a trigger. He kept a small notebook where he recorded each kill, not out of pride, but out of a strange sense of responsibility. These were human beings, he reasoned, even if they were the enemy. They deserved to be counted, remembered in some small way. It was on Guadalcanal that Thomas first encountered the problem that would eventually lead to his famous soup can trick. The Japanese had snipers too, good ones, trained in their own schools, with their own traditions of patience and precision. And they had learned something that Thomas hadn't yet figured out: how to use the jungle itself as a weapon. "They're like ghosts," Lieutenant Morrison said one evening, his hands shaking as he lit a cigarette. Morrison was Thomas's spotter, a former bank clerk from Ohio who had aged 10 years in 6 weeks. "You can't see 'em, you can't hear 'em, they just—" he made a sound like a bullet, "and one of your guys is dead." Thomas nodded. He'd seen it happen. Private Jenkins, a 19-year-old from Iowa, had been laughing at a joke one moment and lying dead in the mud the next, a neat hole in his forehead. No one had heard the shot. No one had seen the muzzle flash. The jungle had simply reached out and taken him. "We need to find them before they find us," Thomas said. "How? They could be anywhere, in the trees, in the grass, in those damned caves." "They're human," Thomas said quietly. "They make mistakes. They get impatient. They get curious." He paused, thinking about his father's words from long ago. "We just have to make them reveal themselves." The idea came to him 3 days later, during a rare quiet moment. Thomas was eating his ration, a tin of condensed tomato soup that tasted like metallic sadness, when he noticed something. The empty tin, when tapped against a rock, made a distinctive sound. a hollow, ringing clatter that carried surprisingly far in the dense jungle air. More importantly, it was a sound that didn't belong. Thomas had spent his childhood listening to the Kansas plains, learning to distinguish between sounds that fit and sounds that didn't. A coyote moving through wheat sounded different from wind moving through wheat. A rabbit's rustle was different from a snake's. And here, in this alien jungle, an empty soup can clattering against stone was a sound that screamed human presence to anyone paying attention. The question was, how could he use this? The first experiment was crude. Thomas tied a length of string to an empty ration tin and placed it 30 yards from his position behind a fallen log. Then he waited. 2 hours later, a Japanese patrol of 5 soldiers passed within 10 feet of the tin. Thomas waited until they were well past, then gave the string a sharp tug. The tin clattered. All 5 soldiers spun toward the sound, rifles raised. They were backlit by the afternoon sun filtering through the canopy, their silhouettes perfectly outlined. Thomas killed 3 of them in the next 4 seconds. The other 2 fled into the jungle, and he got 1 more before the vegetation swallowed him. 4 kills, 1 empty soup can, 0 risk. Lieutenant Morrison stared at Thomas with something like awe when he made his report. "You used a tin can?" Thomas shrugged. "Sound makes people look. Looking makes people visible. Visible makes people dead." That's brilliant." "It's just hunting," Thomas said. "Same as back home. You find what makes the prey move, and you use it." Over the following weeks, Thomas refined his technique. He learned that the timing of the sound mattered. Too soon after the patrol passed, and they'd simply take cover. Too late, and they'd be too far away for a clean shot. The sweet spot was about 3 seconds after they thought they were safe. Just long enough for them to relax, but not long enough for them to fully process the threat. He learned that the position of the sound source mattered too. Place it in front of the patrol, and they'd advance cautiously, keeping cover. Place it behind them, and they'd spin around, exposing themselves completely. Place it to the side at a 45-degree angle, and they'd turn their heads but not their bodies, giving Thomas a perfect temple shot. Most importantly, he learned that the sound itself created a psychological effect that went beyond simple distraction. The enemy soldiers knew they were being hunted, but they couldn't understand how. The jungle would make a strange noise, metallic, artificial, wrong, and then one of their comrades would die. Over and over again, the same pattern, the strange sound, then death. By the end of his Guadalcanal deployment, Japanese soldiers in his sector had started calling him Yūrei no Oto, the ghost of sound. They didn't know his name or his face. They just knew that when the strange clattering came from the jungle, someone was about to die. Thomas was evacuated from Guadalcanal in February 1943 with 41 confirmed kills. He was awarded the Silver Star and promoted to sergeant. More importantly, he had proven his concept. The soup can trick worked. Now he needed to perfect it. The military hospital in Pearl Harbor was a strange place to develop new killing techniques, but that's exactly what Sergeant Thomas Hartley did during his 3-month recovery from malaria. While other soldiers played cards and wrote letters home, Thomas filled notebooks with diagrams, calculations, and observations about the relationship between sound and human psychology. He had noticed something on Guadalcanal that intrigued him. The enemy's reaction to his soup can sounds had changed over time. In the beginning, they had simply turned toward the noise, presenting easy targets. But as word spread about the ghost of sound, their reactions became more complex. Some froze, some panicked and ran. Some, the most dangerous ones, immediately dropped to the ground and refused to move, making themselves nearly impossible to hit. The human fear response, Thomas realized, wasn't uniform. It varied based on expectation, experience, and individual psychology. And if he could predict that variation, he could exploit it. He started reading everything he could find about military psychology. The hospital library was limited, but he found a few useful texts on shell shock from the First World War, and a surprisingly detailed Japanese manual on warrior psychology that had been captured during the Bataan campaign. He also talked to other wounded soldiers, asking them about their experiences with fear. "The worst part isn't the dying," a Marine named Kowalski told him. Kowalski had lost both legs to a Japanese grenade and would never walk again. "The worst part is the not knowing. When you hear something and you don't know what it is or where it came from, that's when your brain just stops working." Thomas wrote that down. Not knowing paralyzes. Uncertainty is more terrifying than certainty, even when certainty means death. He began to develop a more sophisticated system. Instead of one soup can, he would use multiple sound sources, placed at different distances and angles from his position. Instead of simply triggering the sound to make targets look, he would create patterns, sequences of sounds that told a story the enemy's mind couldn't help but try to understand. First sound, distant, to the left. The enemy turns, searching. Second sound, closer, to the right. The enemy spins, confused. Third sound, behind them. Now panic sets in. Where is it coming from? What is it? The enemy's brain is so busy trying to solve the puzzle that it forgets to do the one thing that might save them: take cover. And in that moment of cognitive overload, Thomas would fire. He also developed what he called the phantom effect. Before engaging a target, he would trigger sounds from multiple positions without firing. The enemy would hear the strange clattering, brace for attack, and nothing would happen. Then again, and again. Eventually, they would start to relax. They would begin to think the sounds were harmless, maybe animals, maybe the wind, maybe their own imaginations playing tricks. And then Thomas would fire. The psychological effect was devastating. The sounds that the enemy had learned to ignore were suddenly associated with death. Every noise became a threat. Every moment of silence became the terrible anticipation of what might come next. Soldiers who had been battle-hardened veterans began jumping at shadows, flinching at every rustle of leaves. One captured Japanese officer, interviewed after the war, described the experience: "We knew there was a sniper. We knew about his sounds. But we could never predict when the sound would mean death and when it would mean nothing. It was like playing Russian roulette with our ears. Some men stopped sleeping, some stopped eating. One man in my unit shot himself just to escape the waiting." Thomas spent his recovery time designing what he called his tactical acoustic array. It was simple enough that he could assemble it from standard military supplies: empty ration tins, lengths of string, small wooden stakes, and a few carefully placed counterweights. The entire system could be set up by one man in about 2 hours and covered an area roughly 500 yards in diameter. He also designed different sound patterns for different tactical situations. Pattern Alpha was for ambushes, a single sound to the rear of the target followed by rapid fire before they could react. Pattern Beta was for stationary targets like sentries, a gradual sequence of sounds that would draw them away from their posts and into his kill zone. Pattern Gamma was for groups, a confusion pattern designed to scatter the enemy and pick them off individually. When Thomas was cleared for duty in May 1943, he submitted a formal proposal to the Marine Corps Scout Sniper Command. He called it Acoustic Target Manipulation, a new doctrine for sniper operations. The response was lukewarm. "Sounds gimmicky," wrote one colonel. "We need snipers who can shoot, not snipers who can play with tin cans." But Major Harrison Beck, who had commanded the sniper training school at Camp Pendleton, saw something in the proposal. "Let him try it," he wrote in his endorsement. "If it works, we've got a new weapon. If it doesn't, we've lost nothing but a few empty soup cans." Permission granted. Thomas was attached to the 96th Infantry Division and sent to the Pacific. His destination, the island of Okinawa, where the Japanese had prepared some of the most formidable defenses of the entire war. He packed his rifle, his notebooks, and 37 empty soup cans. Okinawa was different from Guadalcanal. Thomas knew it the moment he stepped off the transport ship onto the shell-cratered beach. Guadalcanal had been jungle warfare, green, wet, claustrophobic. Okinawa was a moonscape of ridges and caves, a terrain shaped by thousands of years of erosion and 3 weeks of the heaviest naval bombardment in Pacific War history. It was April 1945. The war in Europe was almost over. Hitler would be dead within weeks. But here in the Pacific, the Japanese were fighting with a ferocity that defied comprehension. They had 130,000 troops dug into caves, bunkers, and tunnel systems that honeycombed the island's rocky ridges. They had no intention of surrendering. They intended to make the Americans pay for every inch of ground with blood. Thomas was assigned to the 381st Infantry Regiment, which had been tasked with clearing a position known on the military maps as Hill 178, but which the soldiers had already renamed Slaughterhouse Ridge. The ridge was a natural fortress, steep on all sides, pockmarked with caves and spider holes, defended by an estimated 300 Japanese troops who had orders to die rather than retreat. "We've lost 40 men trying to take that goddamn hill," Captain Williams told Thomas during his briefing. Williams was a thin man with haunted eyes and a habit of chain-smoking Lucky Strikes. 40 good men, and we haven't even gotten halfway up the slope.
"What's the main problem?" Thomas asked.
"Snipers. They've got maybe a dozen of them dug into those caves, and we can't see them until they fire. By then, one of our boys is dead." Williams lit another cigarette with shaking hands. "Command wants the ridge taken by Friday. That gives us 5 days. At this rate, we won't have anyone left to take it." Thomas studied the tactical map. The ridge was about 600 yards long and 300 yards deep at its widest point. The caves were concentrated on the forward slope, giving the Japanese clear sight lines to any approach. The only dead ground, areas not visible to the defenders, was on the extreme flanks, but those routes were steep and exposed to fire from adjacent positions. "I need to see it," Thomas said. "Tonight." That night, under a moonless sky, Thomas crawled to within 200 yards of the ridge's base. He lay motionless for 4 hours, watching and listening. He counted muzzle flashes when the Japanese fired harassment shots at the American lines. He mapped the locations of sentries by their silhouettes against the stars. He noted the rhythm of their movements, when they changed positions, when they seemed most alert, when they relaxed. By dawn, he had a plan. "I need 3 days," he told Captain Williams. "No attacks, no probing actions. Just let them sit there. I'll be working the area around the ridge, but I need everyone else to stay back." Williams stared at him. "You want me to tell command we're sitting on our asses for 3 days while one sniper plays with soup cans?" "Tell them whatever you want," Thomas said. "But if you give me 3 days, I'll cut their sniper problem in half. Then your men can take the ridge without walking into a meat grinder." Williams looked at Thomas for a long moment, seeing something in those pale gray eyes that he didn't quite understand but knew he couldn't dismiss. "3 days," he said finally. "But if this doesn't work, it's your ass on the line, Sergeant." "Fair enough," Thomas said, and then he went to work. The first night was about preparation, not killing. Thomas moved through the darkness like a shadow, placing his soup cans with the precision of a surgeon laying out instruments before an operation. Each can was positioned according to a careful calculation: distance from the target area, angle of sound projection, likelihood of discovery. He had modified his original design since Guadalcanal. The cans were now attached to a system of thin wires that ran back to a central control point about 200 yards behind the front line of his acoustic array. From there, he could trigger any can individually or in combination, creating complex sound patterns that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. By 0300, he had placed 23 cans in a semicircle around the eastern slope of the ridge, the area where he had observed the highest concentration of enemy snipers. The remaining 14 cans he kept in reserve for situations he couldn't yet anticipate. As he worked, he thought about what he was doing, really thought about it for the first time in months. Back home, he'd been a farm boy who shot coyotes to protect his father's chickens. Now he was a professional killer, a man who had ended nearly 50 human lives and was preparing to end dozens more. He wondered what Lucy Whitmore would think if she could see him now, crawling through the mud with a rifle on his back and death in his eyes. He pushed the thought away. There would be time for reflection later, if he survived. At 0430, Thomas reached his primary firing position, a small depression behind a cluster of rocks about 400 yards from the ridge. It wasn't ideal. The angle was slightly wrong, and there was a persistent wind that would make long shots difficult. But it had one crucial advantage. It was completely hidden from the enemy's observation posts. He could fire all day, and they would never know where the shots were coming from. As the first gray light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Thomas settled into position and began to wait. He ate a small breakfast of cold rations. No soup today, he thought with grim humor, and then lay motionless, his eye pressed to his scope, watching the ridge come alive. The Japanese had learned, after 3 weeks of fighting, that American soldiers rarely attacked at night. They used the darkness for rest, for reinforcement, for resupply. So when the sun rose, the defenders of Slaughterhouse Ridge emerged from their caves and tunnels to man their positions, brew their tea, and prepare for another day of killing. Thomas counted them as they appeared. 1, 5, 12, 23. The ridge was coming alive with movement. He identified officers by their swords and the quality of their uniforms. He marked the locations of machine gun positions by the distinctive shapes of the Type 92 heavy machine guns being set up in cave mouths. He noted the patrol patterns of sentries as they walked their assigned routes. But he didn't fire. Not yet. At 0630, he triggered his first sound, a single can, positioned about 50 yards to the left of a cave mouth, where he had observed 3 soldiers eating their breakfast. The hollow clatter echoed across the rocks. All 3 soldiers looked up. One of them stood, reaching for his rifle. They stared in the direction of the sound for perhaps 10 seconds, then went back to their meal. Thomas waited 15 minutes, then triggered another can, this one about 100 yards to the right of the first. Again, soldiers looked up. Again, they searched for the source. Again, they eventually relaxed. Throughout the day, Thomas triggered sounds at irregular intervals, never firing, never revealing his presence. Just noise. Strange, inexplicable noise that seemed to have no source and no meaning. By midday, he had observed that the soldiers' reactions were already changing. Some ignored the sounds entirely. Others remained on high alert for minutes after each occurrence, their heads swiveling, their rifles ready. He was sorting them, separating the cautious from the careless, identifying the ones who had combat instincts from the ones who were just following orders. Because when he started killing, he wanted to take the dangerous ones first. As the sun set on the first day, Thomas had fired exactly 0 rounds and killed exactly 0 enemies. But he had mapped every position on the ridge, identified every sniper nest, and established a baseline for how the defenders responded to unexpected sounds. More importantly, he had planted something in their minds, a seed of uncertainty, a whisper of fear. Tomorrow, that seed would begin to grow. Thomas was in position before dawn, having spent another sleepless night observing the ridge's nighttime routines. The Japanese maintained only a skeleton watch during the darkest hours, 5 sentries walking predictable routes, their footsteps crunching on the rocky ground. He had their patterns memorized down to the minute. At 0545, Just as the first gray light touched the eastern horizon, Thomas triggered 3 cans in rapid succession: left, right, center. The sounds echoed like strange, hollow laughter across the ridge. A sentry near the ridge's northern end spun toward the sound, his rifle raised. Thomas had identified this man yesterday as one of the dangerous ones, an older soldier who moved with the careful economy of a veteran. He would be the first to die. Thomas squeezed the trigger. The Springfield barked, and the sentry crumpled without a sound. Before his body hit the ground, Thomas had already worked the bolt and found his second target. Another sentry who was still looking toward the soup can sounds, his back turned to Thomas's position. 2 shots, 2 kills, less than 4 seconds. The ridge exploded into chaos. Shouts in Japanese echoed from the caves. Soldiers scrambled for cover, unsure where the attack was coming from. Thomas saw muzzle flashes as panicked defenders fired wildly into the darkness, hitting nothing but rocks and shadows. He didn't fire again. Instead, he lay motionless, watching through his scope as the confusion gradually subsided. An officer, Thomas had spotted him yesterday, a lieutenant with a ceremonial sword, emerged from a cave and began barking orders. Soldiers took up defensive positions, their rifles pointed outward. But they were pointing in the wrong direction, toward the soup cans, not toward Thomas. For 3 hours, Thomas watched and waited. The sun rose. The ridge baked in the tropical heat. The Japanese soldiers, wound tight with tension, maintained their alert posture. But as the hours passed with no further attacks, they began to relax. One by one, they lowered their rifles. A few lit cigarettes. Conversation resumed. At 09:30, Thomas triggered another can. The effect was electric. Every soldier on the ridge spun toward the sound, and in that moment of distraction, Thomas took 3 more of them. Headshot, chest shot, headshot. The bolt worked smooth as silk, the rifle barely moving between shots. 5 kills before noon, and still the Japanese had no idea where the shots were coming from. The afternoon brought a change in tactics. The Japanese had realized that the sounds and the deaths were connected, so they began to ignore the soup can noises. When Thomas triggered a can at 1400, not a single soldier looked. They stayed in their positions, eyes scanning the terrain, waiting for the muzzle flash that would reveal their tormentor's location. Thomas smiled. This was exactly what he had hoped for. He triggered 3 more cans over the next hour, and each time, the soldiers ignored the sounds. They were learning, adapting, becoming conditioned to dismiss the metallic clattering as a harmless distraction. At 15:30, Thomas switched to pattern Gamma, the confusion pattern. He triggered 5 cans in rapid succession from 5 different directions, creating a cascade of sound that seemed to encircle the ridge. The effect was overwhelming. Even the most disciplined soldiers couldn't help but look, trying to make sense of the auditory chaos. Thomas killed 4 more in the next 6 seconds. 9 confirmed kills on the second day. The Japanese were now in an impossible psychological bind. If they ignored the sounds, they might miss a genuine threat. If they reacted to the sounds, they exposed themselves to Thomas's rifle. Every choice was wrong. Every moment was potentially their last. That night, Thomas heard something he had never heard before on a Pacific battlefield: Japanese soldiers crying. The sound drifted across the rocks from the caves of Slaughterhouse Ridge. Muffled sobs, choked prayers, the sounds of men breaking under a pressure they couldn't understand or fight. He felt nothing. Or rather, he felt something, but he buried it deep beneath the cold focus of the mission. There would be time to feel later. Right now, there was only the rifle, the scope, and the ever-growing list of targets. The total count stood at 11, 101 more to go. The Japanese fought back on the third day. Thomas had known they would. He was dealing with Imperial Japanese Army soldiers, not conscripts or militia. These were trained warriors with their own traditions of courage and cunning. At dawn, he observed a patrol of 8 soldiers leaving the ridge's western flank. They moved in 2-man teams, spread out to minimize casualties from a single shot, heading directly toward the area where Thomas had placed the highest concentration of soup cans. They were hunting him. Thomas considered his options. He could withdraw, abandon his position, and set up somewhere new. But that would cost him time the Japanese would use to reinforce their defenses and adapt to his tactics. He could engage the patrol, but 8 targets moving through difficult terrain would be hard to eliminate before at least some of them went to ground. Or he could use the patrol against itself. He let them get close, within 50 yards of his first line of soup cans. Then he triggered a sequence. 1 can near the lead team, then 1 near the rear team, then 1 in the center. The patrol froze, suddenly realizing they were inside the Soundmaker's web. An NCO in the center of the formation shouted an order, and the patrol began to spread out further, searching for the string and can contraptions. Thomas watched them through his scope, tracking their movements, waiting. One soldier found a can. He shouted in triumph and cut the string with his bayonet. Thomas noted his position but didn't fire. Another can was found, and another. The soldiers were gaining confidence now, laughing with relief as they realized the ghost's trick was nothing but tin cans on strings. One of them held up a can and made a mocking speech, probably explaining to his comrades that the American devil they had feared was just a coward playing children's games. Thomas shot him through the neck. Before the body hit the ground, Thomas triggered every remaining can in the area simultaneously. The cascade of sound was deafening, echoing off the rocks in a chaotic symphony. The patrol scattered, running in every direction, desperate to escape the invisible killer who seemed to be everywhere at once. Thomas killed 3 more before they reached cover. Then he waited. The 4 survivors were pinned down among the rocks, unable to move without exposing themselves. Thomas could see their hiding spots, but he didn't have clean shots. So he did what he did best. He waited. The Pacific sun climbed higher, turning the rocks into a furnace. Thomas had water in his canteen, but the Japanese soldiers had been traveling light. He watched through his scope as their discipline began to crack. One soldier tried to crawl to a better position. Thomas put a round through his hip, immobilizing him but not killing him. The wounded man's screams echoed across the ridge for 3 hours. At 1400, another soldier broke. He stood up and ran toward the ridge, either trying to escape or simply unable to bear the waiting any longer. Thomas let him get 20 yards before dropping him. The last 2 soldiers surrendered at sunset, throwing down their rifles and walking toward the American lines with their hands raised. Thomas watched them go, feeling nothing but a faint sense of professional satisfaction. 6 kills, 2 prisoners. The counter patrol had been eliminated at no cost. But the soup cans in that sector were gone now, destroyed by the Japanese before Thomas could stop them. He would have to work with a smaller acoustic array for the remaining 2 days. He made a mental note. Next time, place decoy cans, dummies that would attract the enemy's attention while the real sound makers remained hidden. Day 3 total, 17 kills. Running count, 28. Something changed on the 4th day. Thomas could see it through his scope. A different quality to the defenders' movements, a heaviness in their posture that hadn't been there before. The Japanese soldiers on Slaughterhouse Ridge were broken men now, their samurai spirit crushed by 4 days of invisible terror. They had stopped trying to fight back. No more patrols ventured out to find the soup cans. No more sentries walked the perimeter. The soldiers huddled in their caves and tunnels, refusing to emerge even for essential duties. The machine gun positions that had been manned around the clock were now abandoned, their crews preferring the darkness of the caves to the killing ground of the ridge's surface. Thomas should have felt satisfied. His plan was working exactly as he had hoped. The enemy's will to fight was crumbling. When the American infantry finally attacked, they would face an enemy already half defeated. Instead, he felt something else, something cold and heavy in his chest. He recognized it, dimly, as the beginning of what the doctors at the hospital had called combat fatigue. The weight of all those kills was starting to settle on his shoulders, one body at a time. He pushed the feeling away and focused on the mission. At 800, Thomas initiated what he called the systematic clearance. Working from east to west, he triggered sounds to draw defenders out of each cave in turn, picking them off as they emerged. The pattern was simple but devastating. A sound near the cave mouth would make soldiers inside peer out cautiously, and Thomas would take them one by one. Some refused to emerge at all, no matter what sounds he made. For these, Thomas had developed a different technique. He would trigger sounds at random intervals throughout the day, keeping the soldiers inside the cave on constant alert. They couldn't sleep, they couldn't eat in peace. They couldn't do anything but wait for a death that might come at any moment. By late morning, he had killed 18 more enemy soldiers. The ridge was becoming a graveyard, bodies lying where they had fallen, their comrades too terrified to retrieve them. At 1300, something extraordinary happened. A Japanese soldier emerged from a cave near the ridge's center, unarmed, waving a white cloth. He walked slowly toward the American lines, his hands clearly visible, shouting something in broken English. "No shoot! No shoot! I surrender! Many surrender! No more shoot!" Thomas tracked him through his scope but held his fire. Behind the first soldier, others began to emerge. First a handful, then a dozen, then more. They threw down their rifles, their swords, their grenades. They walked with the shuffling gait of men who had already accepted death and were surprised to still be alive. In 30 minutes, 43 Japanese soldiers surrendered. It was one of the largest mass surrenders of the Pacific War, unprecedented for an enemy that had been taught that surrender was worse than death. Captain Williams arrived at Thomas's position as the prisoners were being led away. His face was a mixture of awe and horror. "What the hell did you do to them?" he asked. Thomas lowered his rifle and rubbed his eyes. "I made them hear death coming," he said. "And then I made them wait for it. They're saying you're a demon, a spirit. They're calling you Yūrei no Oto, something about the sound of ghosts." "I'm just a sniper," Thomas said, "with some empty soup cans." William shook his head. "This is going to change things, Sergeant. The brass is already talking about your methods. They want to understand how you did this." Thomas looked at the ridge, at the bodies scattered across its slopes, at the caves that had become tombs for so many. "Tell them it's simple," he said. "Sound makes people look. Looking makes people visible. And in war, visible means dead." Day 4 total, 61 eliminations, 18 killed, 43 surrendered. Running count, 89 confirmed. The final day began with artillery. American 105mm howitzers pounded the ridge for 2 hours at dawn, preparing for the infantry assault that would finally take Slaughterhouse Ridge. Thomas watched from his position as shell after shell exploded among the caves, collapsing tunnels and burying the defenders who had chosen to stay and fight. When the barrage lifted, he was ready. The surviving Japanese soldiers, disoriented by the shelling, emerged from the surviving caves to assess the damage. Thomas had repositioned his remaining soup cans during the night, creating a new acoustic array on the ridge's northern slope, the route the infantry would use for their assault. As the first American soldiers began their advance, Thomas went to work. Each time an enemy soldier raised his head to fire at the attackers, Thomas triggered a sound behind him. The soldier would turn, instinctively, and Thomas would end him. The technique had become so refined, so automatic, that each kill took less than 2 seconds from sound to shot. 12 kills in the first hour, 7 more by noon. By 1400, the 381st Infantry had reached the ridge's crest, finding only a handful of dazed defenders still capable of resistance. Thomas killed 4 more during the final mopping-up operation, picking off soldiers who tried to escape through the ridge's southern approaches. His last kill of the battle was a Japanese officer, the lieutenant with the ceremonial sword whom Thomas had first spotted on day 1. The man was trying to rally a group of survivors for a final banzai charge. Thomas shot him through the chest, and the charge never materialized. The survivors surrendered. By 1600, Slaughterhouse Ridge was in American hands. Thomas Hartley descended from his firing position for the first time in 5 days. He walked among the dead, looking at faces he had seen only through a scope. Some were young, boys, really, no older than 17 or 18. Others were hardened veterans with weathered faces and calloused hands. All of them had families somewhere, mothers and fathers who would never know exactly how their sons had died. He found his notebook and added the final count. 23 kills on day 5. Total for the 5-day operation, 112 confirmed enemy casualties. 89 killed, 23 captured or surrendered directly due to his actions. 1 man, 37 soup cans, 112 enemies eliminated. Captain Williams found him sitting on a rock at the ridge's summit, staring at the setting sun. "Hell of a job, Sergeant," Williams said. "Hell of a job." Thomas didn't respond. He was thinking about Kansas, about wheat fields, about a life that seemed impossibly far away. "You okay?" Williams asked. Thomas finally looked at him. Those pale gray eyes were different now, older somehow, as if 5 days had added 50 years. "I'm fine," he said. "I just need a minute." Williams nodded and walked away, leaving the sniper alone with his thoughts and his rifle and the ghosts of 112 men who had heard the strange sound of death coming for them and had been powerless to stop it. Sergeant Thomas Hartley was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions on Slaughterhouse Ridge, the second highest military decoration for valor. The citation praised his exceptional gallantry and extraordinary achievement, but mentioned nothing about soup cans. The Army, it seemed, found the truth somewhat embarrassing. After the war, Thomas returned to Kansas and married Lucy Whitmore in the spring of 1946. They had 3 children and ran the family farm until Thomas's death in 1998 at the age of 76. He never spoke publicly about his wartime experiences, and when his children asked about his medals, he would simply say, "I did what I had to do." But the military didn't forget what he had accomplished. In 1947, the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency commissioned a classified study of Hartley's methods, examining how acoustic manipulation could be used for psychological warfare. The study led to a series of programs that would influence American military tactics for decades, from Vietnam-era harassment operations to modern counterinsurgency techniques. The principles Thomas discovered in the jungles of Guadalcanal and the ridges of Okinawa are still taught today in special operations schools around the world. The language is different now. They call it acoustic deception or environmental manipulation, but the core insight remains the same. In combat, uncertainty is more terrifying than danger. A soldier who knows where the threat is coming from can fight back. A soldier who hears death but cannot see it, cannot predict it, cannot understand it, that soldier is already half defeated. In 2015, the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School at Quantico dedicated a new training facility to the memory of Sergeant Thomas "Tin Man" Hartley. The facility includes a museum of sniper warfare, where visitors can see one of the original soup cans that Thomas used on Okinawa, a rusted Campbell's tomato soup tin still attached to a length of frayed string. The can is displayed in a glass case with a simple plaque that reads, "Cost 0.1 cents. Effect, immeasurable. Thomas Hartley was buried in the small cemetery outside Holton, Kansas, next to his mother and his infant sister. His gravestone bears only his name, his dates, and a simple inscription that his widow Lucy chose from his notebook, "The land talks if you listen." But those who knew the true story of Slaughterhouse Ridge sometimes visit the grave and leave something behind, a small tribute that most visitors would find puzzling. Empty soup cans, stacked neatly at the base of the stone, their labels faded by sun and rain. The wind blows across the Kansas plains, rustling the wheat, and sometimes, just sometimes, one of those cans shifts slightly, making a faint metallic sound. A hollow clatter that drifts across the cemetery, barely audible, easily mistaken for nothing at all. But if you know what to listen for, if you've been trained to hear the sounds that don't belong, you might pause and look around, suddenly aware of just how exposed you are, standing there in the open Kansas sunlight. That's the last lesson Thomas Hartley taught. Even now, even here, even when you're perfectly safe, you never forget the sound of death coming for you.